MPB viewers and listeners are quite familiar with Dr. Rick deShazo through his work on radio and television. You've probably already figured out that he's a pretty smart guy. But what you may not know, he is a medical dossier that reads like an encyclopedia. He specializes in internal medicine and pediatrics, rheumatology and asthma and allergy ailments, just to name a few. He's also been involved in upwards of over 400 medical publications. But there's one in particular that you need to know about today. It's a book he is authoring about the history of black physicians practicing in Mississippi. It's called The Racial Divide in American Medicine. Dr. Rick, it's great to see you today.
Great to be here.
I always like visiting with you, number one, because, I could sit here probably for the next 30 minutes and read your resume and fill up the whole time. I mean, you've done so much for the state of Mississippi and so much in your career as well. You and I got here about the same time. And I think we both were fascinated with Mississippi for much the same reasons, because we felt like for what we did that there was a need. You, of course, medicine, and you have been a huge advocate from everything from, food deserts to diet to being here on MPB and doing that. What is it that drives you?
Well, I was very fortunate to grow up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where we were the only WASP. Okay, we had Italians on one side, Jews on another, Lebanese. It was a working class neighborhood of immigrants. And that experience gave me an interest in trying to learn what happens in communities. And then we had a maid, which was unusual for all the other folks. My mother worked outside the home. I was an only child, very bored, looking for stuff to do. And we had a wonderful maid named Mary Rice. And she was really my mentor, because my mother and father, my father died early. My mother was at work all the time. She was the one who taught me Bible stories and so forth and so on, how to hold a fork. And yet I saw her go down over a period of years, health-wise. Right. And I couldn't figure out why she was not going to the doctor like everybody else. My mother took me to the doctor every time I smiled, much less coughed. And came to find out that when Mother did take her to the doctor, she snuck her in on the weekend in the back door and took her to the dental office where she worked and bootlegged blood pressure medicine and other things into her, because blacks couldn't be seen at that facility. And then these questions, why was this? How could this happen?
I imagine as a kid, how do you sit there, you look at your mom and say, why?
Well, I asked my Sunday school teacher.
Yeah.
And of course, my mom took me to Sunday school every Sunday. And I said, I asked her the same question I asked our mothers, how can this be? And the answer was, it's just the way it is. So eventually I asked Miss Mary, our maid, and she had a different answer. She said, you're going to figure it out.
Wow.
And it was that key that got me interested in trying to understand how things are still so broken, not just in Mississippi, but the whole country, so far as the way we look at health, who ought to be getting health. It used not to, it didn't matter a whole lot, because we didn't have a lot to offer. Things are very, very different, as you know from your own experience now, that we have so many good things to offer. If we can just get that information and those services out, we can significantly improve the quality of life. But that's not happening.
You're sitting there, of course, you started out, you had military experience, and so you were able to kind of go off and see the world and travel a little bit and get outside the South. So that helped enlighten you and
That was a nice follow-up to growing up in this sort of multicultural neighborhood.
Right.
When I got in the military, it was during Vietnam, and I was drafted. I thought I was going to Vietnam, and unbeknownst to me, I had a cousin from Alabama who was a two-star general that I had never met.
It's a good cousin to have.
And so all of a sudden I got this call, Dr. deShazo, would you rather go to Walter Reed or would you rather go to Vietnam? And I said, well, I'm a pediatrician. And they said, well, we don't have a spot for a pediatrician. We'll take an internist. And I said, I'm an internist. So I went to Walter Reed, and there was no difference. It didn't make any difference who you were, what color you were. It was what you had accomplished, what your rank was. And I thought that was refreshing. I thought maybe we all ought to be judged by who we are and what we're accomplished and what direction we're going in, rather than what color we are or where we came from. And of course, being from the South, in a place like Walter Reed, the fact that I talked in a foreign language, everybody assumed I was an idiot, right? Because I talk slow and funny. Well, I was on the other side of the 8-ball, and it's the first time I really had that experience to try to understand why our preconceptions about other people frequently steer us in the wrong direction.
You made it back to Alabama. You were at the University of South Alabama. What brought you to Mississippi?
Well, actually, I went to Tulane first,
That's right.
And then I went to South Alabama. South Alabama was a new community-based medical school, and I graduated from the O-line school in Birmingham, which I love, and it was an opportunity to help build a new medical school, and that's why I went there. And Mobile and New Orleans are very, very different, the whole Gulf Coast, so far as their attitudes and aptitudes are concerned. For instance, Mobile did not have a civil rights adventure. When the African Americans said it's time to integrate, they sat down and they integrated. And although they're not totally integrated, certainly the public schools, and nobody wanted turmoil because they knew that was not going to work. And I kept reading about Mississippi and its experience, but the big piece was the health disparities. I could not understand why people of God, all right, as religious as all of us are, would tolerate these disparities. I mean, the fact that black individuals were living 5 to 7 years less than the same demographic whites. How could that be? And, Miss Mary taught me it's the great commandment you need to remember, the one about loving your neighbor as yourself. And that kept going around in my brain, and I could not understand it. And I still don't totally understand it, but I'm certainly getting a better idea.
You got here, 1998, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what were your first impressions when you came to the state?
That people were wonderful.
Yeah.
That people were so caring and open. And you really couldn't tell until you separated the colors and the socioeconomic groups that there were really old prejudices among those. Right. The social skills, the veneer of civilization here is so thick. And then the church piece makes that even thicker because we're all told we have to love each other, but sometimes we have a lot of trouble doing that. But you can cover it up if you give to this charity, do this, and go to this thing. You can cover up the problems that you have with other people and history. Mm-hmm. And so much of what has happened in our state, you're a historian yourself, is stuff we've inherited from the past. And it's not just a Southern thing, because all this problem started on the East Coast and started with the first U.S. Constitution when the formers of our Constitution couldn't decide about whether slavery, which was always already in place in all those tobacco plantations up on the East Coast, should continue or not. Right. So they put this stuff in the Constitution. You couldn't touch the importation of slaves for 25 years. And it just sort of rolled on down there from that. And then right before the Civil War, when we suddenly had an opportunity to become rich in the South with the cotton gin, and there were 847,000 slaves imported into Mississippi alone in the 5 years before the start of the Civil War, because they were selling them in the East Coast as the states outlawed slavery gradually, and they had produced a lot of them. Slaves were basically grown like puppies and sold and bartered for. And so the Natchez Trace was a natural flow down to Mississippi, plus Port of Mobile was also a good place, and
Natchez
New
was-
Orleans.
yeah, Natchez.
Natchez was a slave market, and so was Vicksburg.
Right.
So we had this huge influx of African Americans who actually initially got better health care than the poor whites around them.
I know you think about Joseph and Jefferson Davis and their plantations. I mean, that's a classic example.
Amazing story, isn't it? Joseph was the brother of Jefferson, and of the two, he's the guy I'd like to have a beer with.
He was like 27 years older, too.
I
He
mean,
was much
this
older,
guy was incredible. He was a very successful Vicksburg lawyer. And of course, everybody who was successful in the South wanted to have a plantation. And so he bought all this swampland a little bit south or north, or close to Vicksburg, and named it Davis Bend. And then these two, a hurricane and the other hurricane developed side by side, the brothers shared. And he got very interested in improving health there and developed a slave hospital. And that slave hospital ended up being one of several that was sort of the paradigm that was developed subsequently during Reconstruction for the separate hospital for blacks and whites. But it was a good hospital. It was well run.
Talk a little bit about your career. Of course, you've been at University of Mississippi Medical Center, and it's a teaching hospital. So you were directing pretty much the next generation of doctors at that point. You know, I mean, right after you got there, it seems like, you know, Katrina seems like it was yesterday, but it's been 12 years. The medical center's response to Katrina, you were right in the middle of that. And then, of course, you started seeing more and more need to be able to get to Mississippians and help them. You started with Southern Remedy. Talk a little bit about some of the arc of your career at UMMC.
Well, the great thing about UMMC was the diversity of the place. Certainly the majority of the students and the trainees there were Mississippians, but many of the faculty were from somewhere else. And that had gradually grown, and there was a big interest in trying to explain to Mississippi natives who were becoming health professionals at any of the 5 schools that being a health provider was more than just writing prescriptions. You had to understand the social determinants of health, and that was those things in society that allow you to be healthy. Access to health care, food and nutrition. Boy, we've both been interested in that one. And all those things that result in you being a healthy person. I didn't find that in the other schools I was looking at the time for jobs. It was just a unique place, and I have been supported so well by so many people there in the administration over the years to be able to do what I would have done. That's why it has happened, because you can have great ideas, but if you can't do them, then you're out of luck. So shortly after, it wasn't that long after I got there, we had Katrina. And all of a sudden we got a call from the Red Cross. I didn't realize that the Red Cross didn't provide health care. There was one nurse down at the convention center down there, one nurse, and thousands of people who had been evacuated from the South who came with their oxygen,
diabetes, and
and it was the end of the month, and they didn't have any medicines, so they hadn't gotten their check yet, so they didn't have. So we had a whole, we had both the Coliseum, and we set up a clinic at the exhibition hall over there, and just overnight, and got a lot of help from doing that, from the institution, from pharmacy representatives. Everybody came together and did that. And that was the first time I really understood health disparities, because there were blacks and whites, and I realized that this was way beyond just a racial thing. That's when I learned that there was a higher percentage of people in Mississippi who were white on Medicaid than black. And so it was a socioeconomic thing, not just a racial thing. And that's why it was so hard to break through, because we've got societal issues and racial issues pancaked. And that makes it very difficult.
Southern Remedy, how was that whole concept born?
Well, we had planned, the medical center had planned to start some kind of health promotions thing with public broadcasting. It was a natural partnership. Public broadcasting had come to the medical center. And we were in discussions about that. And with Katrina, I started harping on the administration for resources and things that we could do. And they said, okay, we got this radio opportunity, go do it. And since I was mid-peds, I trained in both of those specialties. I sort of had some information that might be good. And there were no doctors on the coast. The doctors had all evacuated. All the facilities were underwater. So we were doing first aid. We did over the radio for weeks. And that's how that Southern Remedy thing got started.
Yeah, did you ever think you'd be a television radio star?
Well, I'm not sure I'm a star, but certainly I'm busy.
Right.
And, you know, we still have the same basic sets of issues now that we had then. And it has to do with what is a healthy lifestyle.
Right.
And we don't have public education in the schools. I don't know about you, but when I went to elementary school, we had a mandatory hour a week on health.
Yeah.
And everybody had to do a little project, and I knew the food groups and this, that, and the other, and I could do a calorie count. It's gone.
Right.
So people don't understand why they have health problems because of their diets. And then we have the economic piece back again. It's cheaper to eat junk food.
Exactly. If you're working 3 jobs and you got your kids in the back seat, it's a lot easier to go through the drive-through and get the dollar menu.
And I know that you've been very interested in this whole issue of food access, and talked about it numerous times. And so that is a big issue, another nut we haven't cracked.
The book. We talk about the book, and I was reading it over the weekend. I was able to read it. It's just it's a great history book, but it's a great understanding of where we are today. How did you come up with the idea to? I mean, is this something that you've been thinking about for 20 years, or is this just something you finally said, you know what, we got to get people to understand why we have this disparity going on in the state?
Like you, I'm a reader.
I can tell.
And what happened is I discovered this book by Desmond Tutu,
which is incredibly powerful.
And I was trying to figure out why people didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
When I started talking about the things I was discovering from black physicians, I read that book over there, The Good Doctors, which talked about Robert Smith and all the other doctors who were so involved in the civil rights, Dr. Shirley, about 6 of them, who risked their lives to speak out on behalf of their patients and actually forced the integration of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. We were very resistant after the Civil Rights Act of '64 to integrate, and they were helping the university sort of navigate through not getting totally shut down, while at the same time working with the Civil Rights Commission and the federal government to force us to integrate. And the left didn't know what the right was doing, but they did. So because of that, I started reading all kinds of stuff about health disparities and racial reconciliation. Of course, the Winter Institute, I discovered that. Wow.
I know.
What an amazing force. And I kept getting the same response when I said, did you know that Mississippi was heavily involved in civil rights efforts, and we have 2 medical associations in Mississippi? When I discovered that, I said, what? Yeah, we have a black one and a white one. And by the way, we still got them.
Yeah.
And so there were, when I went to the State Medical Association, became active in that, there were, I think, 2 black physicians. I kept hearing about all these other physicians who were black, but they never showed up. They had their own, just like many other states did, the National Medical Association and the American Medical Association, because the American Medical Association refused membership for black physicians, for many, many years. In fact, you can go to the Medical Association and look at the books over there, the registrar's book, and black physicians were S members, scientific members, not given full membership, even when they were allowed to be members, and they had to leave before the dinner that always was associated with the Regional Medical Association because they couldn't eat together, right?
Right.
You brought your wife and you had to sign the meeting, but you couldn't take your white wife in with the black wife and the black man to eat.
Yeah.
And so there was never any discussion about key issues between them. So we still have some of the same issues, but our state medical association has worked hard, as have these others, in dealing with that. So, but every time I talk to the state medical association about this, the same thing comes up. Why do you want to talk about that stuff? Wow. That's old stuff, that's bad stuff. That's not who we are and why we are now.
Only positive Mississippi spoken here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Only positive Mississippi spoken here. Well, it ain't all positive. And the point that Tutu made, they almost had a major revolution in South Africa after apartheid was dissolved, because the blacks were so angry they wanted to kill every white guy around, and white guys wanted to defend themselves because they worked hard to build up all those farms. Yeah. And it was nick and tuck as to who was going to survive. And what he came up with was this whole issue of getting people together and this truth commission, and let both sides hear the other side's stories. Mm-hmm. And then they realized that there was common ground for the first time, that both had been hurt by what had happened. And then there came to be a movement. It's still not perfect, but they're still talking. And that's why he won the Nobel Peace Prize, because he figured this out. And I've always felt that's what we need to do in Mississippi, and that's what the book is. It's getting the facts out there about what has happened, good and bad, in medicine, and how our discrimination against blacks and black physicians has contributed to our health disparities. Because we know that, first of all, we have the poorest ratio of patients to physicians in the U.S. We have the fewest per capita doctors in the U.S. And we also know that African American physicians tend to go to African American communities, regardless of what the finances are there. So we shut them out of the medical school. We shut them out of the medical association. We kept them from getting specialty training up until 1967. And so it's no surprise that we have a lack of black doctors. We have a lack of white doctors as well. And we still have these problems.
So literally the book, which is not out, it's not been published at the point of this taping, but will probably be out by the time this time airs. The point of the book basically is to help cleanse that wound so it can heal.
Plus, it's a fascinating story.
It's a great read.
It's a fascinating story about the dynamic.
Right.
And what has happened in medicine here, it's happened in the clergy.
Right.
It's happened in all the professions. It's certainly happened in the legal profession, because they've already washed their windows pretty well. We're just now getting to washing ours. And every time it's been talked about and exposed and dealt with and not said, ain't it awful, I didn't do it, don't blame me for it, it has brought people together. And been constructive.
One of the things that jumped out at me in the book was, for all those years that African Americans were considered to be subspecies, that they were subhuman. And that definitely will affect healthcare over time, because, if you think somebody's weak or think they're, these are things that people need to understand, I would think, to understand why we're in the position we are today.
One of the biggest and best medical schools in the South was in Mobile. And they recruited a physician named Josiah Nott, N-O-T-T, from the University of Pennsylvania, the leading school. And he spent most of his time there measuring the skulls of black people and comparing them to the skulls of white people, and decided that the skulls of black people were smaller than the skulls of white people, and therefore white people were a different species and smarter. Well, that got in the medical literature.
Yeah.
It was there for years, and there's no correlation whatsoever. It was pseudoscience. And so we poisoned our own community in the way that we thought. Black physicians have, among white physicians, always been considered as not as good. And there's no data on that either. In fact, outcomes are, from the few studies that have been done, are similar. And the state of Mississippi, of course, made sure that black physicians would not get in the Ole Miss Medical School by working with the Southern Regional, and it's in their education group, to send all the black applicants on scholarship off to Meharry Medical School and Howard to keep them out of Ole Miss. And so then when they came back to pay off their debt, they couldn't get into the medical association. Therefore, they couldn't get hospital privileges. Therefore, all they could do was general practice in an office. And after a couple of years of that, they were burned out and they left. And so it was continuous turnover. A few stayed, those good doctors, but most of them left.
Dr. Rick, we've run out of time. I could do this for 2 hours. I really wanted to say thank you for your service to the state of Mississippi. You've had an incredible career here and have done so much good. And I thank you for taking time to sit down with me
Well, thank you
today.
so much for your interest.